By the beginning of 2016, everybody who lived in apartment building number 12 on Shanxi Road in the big Chinese city of Xi'an knew to stay away from the woman who lived at the end of the hall on the 15th floor. Now, they didn't know much about this woman, but what they did know about her was totally bizarre and kind of alarming. The woman, whose family name was Wu, but nobody actually knew this woman's individual name, was 43 years old and she lived alone. And from what residents could tell, nobody ever came to visit her and she almost never left her apartment. But oftentimes, residents on the 15th floor could hear this woman talking to herself very animatedly inside of her apartment, and sometimes she'd even get into these big arguments with herself where it was clear she was kind of playing the role of multiple personalities at once. But none of these things were the reason why people avoided her altogether. They avoided her because she seemed really dangerous. One day, a few months earlier, a teenage girl was walking down the hallway on the 15th floor, making her way towards her friend's apartment, when she passed by this woman's apartment door. And as soon as she walked past, the door to this woman's apartment flew open, and the woman rushed outside and began screaming incoherently. And so this teenage girl, she whips around and sees this woman, and instinctively, what this girl thought was, oh my goodness, this woman is being attacked. She's running away from somebody in her apartment or something. But then very quickly, it became apparent that this woman was not being attacked. She was attacking the teenage girl. So this woman, she looks at the girl and her eyes go wide and she kind of curls her hands into claws. And then she began running down the hall towards this girl. And so the girl, she begins to scream and she turns and she runs down the hall and she manages to pound on her friend's door. And her friend happened to be right behind the door. They opened it up. The girl ran inside and they shut and locked the door right as this woman came barreling into the door. And this behavior from this woman on the 15th floor was just the beginning. Following this first attack, the woman on the 15th floor would routinely barge out of her apartment and chase down young women and teenage girls that were walking past her door. Now, this woman never actually hurt anyone that she chased down and even reached in time. She just kind of scared them. And so as a result, the residents of this apartment building, including the women and young girls who had been attacked by this woman, their reaction to this was not anger or resentment or, some desire to go call the police and have this woman arrested. Instead, the residents of this building just kind of felt bad for this woman. It seemed very obvious that she was mentally unwell and probably very lonely. And so they kind of collectively decided to not call the police and instead just kind of ignore her. But sometime in early February, this woman's random attacks on young women and girls just kind of stopped. And at first, residents, especially of the 15th floor of this apartment building, were just relieved because all of a sudden you could walk down that hallway in peace again. But by the end of February, it dawned on people who lived in this apartment building that not only had this woman stopped her random attacks, but also now they couldn't even hear her inside of her apartment talking to herself because that was something people always heard, and now her apartment was totally silent. And so pretty quickly, people became kind of worried about this woman, but nobody was willing to go knock on her door and actually make sure she was okay, because again, this woman was viewed as being kind of dangerous. I mean, she was literally jumping out of her apartment and attacking random passerbys. And so people just continued to keep their distance from this woman. And so as people did that, they began to tell themselves that, probably she just moved out without anybody noticing, and that's why she's gone quiet. But it would turn out that was not the case. Right around the time the woman on the 15th floor stopped her attacks and went silent, sometime in early February, an elevator inside of this apartment building broke down between floors 11 and 10. And so a maintenance crew was called out to fix the elevator, but when they got there, they realized they didn't have the supplies or the manpower to actually make the fix. And so a decision was made to just cut the power to this individual elevator car, and then the work crew said they'd come back in about a month when they had the right supplies and people. And sure enough, a month later, this crew came back with what they needed, and they were able to lower the broken elevator car down to floor 10, and then they opened up the doors, and they were absolutely horrified at what they saw inside of that car. It's believed that shortly after this woman on the 15th floor had one of her outbreaks and chased someone down the hall, she got into the elevator and began traveling down. And when the elevator car got between floors 11 and 10, it came to a lurching stop. But for some reason, when this happened, the woman did nothing. She didn't yell for help, she didn't scream, she didn't pound on the doors, she didn't press any buttons. She just sat in the elevator car in absolute silence. And so eventually it was discovered that one of the elevator cars in this apartment building was broken, not because the woman had called out, but probably because someone had tried to hail the elevator and it didn't come down. And so that maintenance crew was called out, but they couldn't make the repair, and so they decided to cut the power to that car and come back in a month. Now, this elevator crew had no idea there was anybody inside the elevator car because, again, this woman who was trapped in there was totally silent throughout their attempts to try to fix the car. And so after these workers cut the power to this elevator car and left, this woman was doomed. This woman just sat in silence in this elevator car with no food and no water for several days until she died of dehydration, which is one of the most agonizing and slow ways to go. Now, at some point, this woman did attempt to free herself because there were scratch marks inside the elevator indicating that she had tried to claw her way out, and her hands were totally mutilated, suggesting she really had been clawing pretty hard. But that was the only time she tried to save herself. Otherwise, she just sat there and eventually died. Last winter, me and old Sicko decided to go on a surfing trip. And so naturally, we flew to Colorado and hiked to the very top of the tallest mountain we could possibly find. But unbelievably, there were no beaches up there. And so Lung and I didn't even get to go surfing. But our failed surfing trip did have a silver lining. At the top of that Colorado mountain was a cave. And in that cave, deep within the mountain, was a walrus. And if you know anything about me and old Seagull, as we love giving those walrus a good tongue lashing every chance we get. And so we took that opportunity and really laid into that stupid walrus for about 36 hours. But at the 36-hour mark, the walrus had had enough, and it got up on its flippers, and it began chasing us through the cave. And so me and Lung turned, and we began running for our lives. And as we ran, we did the only thing we knew how to do. We signed up for DraftKings. Now, did that save us from the walrus? No! But did it get us jacked up about football season? Yes, it did. So jacked up, in fact, that this year we're partnering up with DraftKings to make sure all you strange, dark, and mysterious aficionados out there are kept up to date about the very best deals on the DraftKings platform. Like DraftKings' very awesome No Sweat Same Game Parlay, where if your bet loses, you get a bonus bet back in the amount of your original bet. Pretty good. There's also loads of other amazing opportunities on DraftKings, so go check it out. Download the DraftKings Sportsbook app now. New customers use promo code MrBallen, bet $5, and get $200 in bonus bets immediately. That's promo code MrBallen only at DraftKings Sportsbook. At around 5:20 p.m. on August 31st, 2007, a young couple stepped onto the beautiful sand of Yelpo Beach, which is located at the very southern tip of South Korea. The couple grabbed each other's hands and smiled in excitement as they looked out on the water and saw all these fishing boats that dotted the horizon, and then behind them were all these beautiful mountains. I mean, this was a spectacular place. They couldn't believe that a place so gorgeous and so remote was located only a 1-hour train ride away from the busy city where they went to college. The couple's names were Kim and Chu. Kim was 21 years old, and he was an athlete and a very dedicated student. And Chu, she was 20 years old and also very studious, but maybe unlike Kim, she was a bit more reserved and shy. In fact, Kim was Chu's very first serious boyfriend, and she absolutely adored him. And in fact, this was going to be the couple's kind of big first trip that they would take together. It was a Friday, and Kim and Chu planned to spend the entire weekend exploring this place called Yelpo Beach. Yelpo Beach is located right against this quaint little fishing village, and it's famous for its beautiful silver-colored sand. In fact, the beach is so famous, lots of people come out here and just camp out on the beach because it's just so beautiful. There's also a very busy open-air seafood market right nearby, which is really cool because all the fishermen come in and literally offload their catch right onto the table, and they sell it to people coming by. And also up in the mountains, you could see these beautiful bright green crops, which were tea plantations that made the air in Yelpo Beach kind of floral and sweet smelling. But before Kim and Chu began exploring all the kind of main tourist attractions, they wanted to go check out the fishing pier, which was not really a touristy attraction. It was just a regular fishing pier. But, Kim and Chu had been on this hour-long train ride and they wanted to stretch their legs, and the sun was starting to go down. And so they figured they could walk out on the pier, have a beautiful view of the water, and watch the sunset. And then after that, they could go kind of explore the main areas. And so Kim and Chu, still holding hands, began walking on the silver sandy beach in the direction of this fishing pier off in the distance. And as they were walking, Chu pulled out her camera and was taking all these pictures. But then at some point, Kim, who again is holding Chu's hand, he just abruptly stops and kind of squints his eyes and looks off in the distance towards the fishing pier. And Chu, she puts her camera down and asks Kim, what's going on? But Chu, without even saying anything to her, just raises his hand and points. And then seconds later, Kim and Chu were running down the beach. The next day, Chu was supposed to call her mother and check in about how the trip was going so far, but she never did. And so her mother eventually tried calling Chu later in the day, but it went straight to voicemail. And then also when Chu's mother called Kim, Kim was also not answering his phone. And so by the end of this day, when Kim and Chu's parents had not heard from their child, they did not wait for any more information. They knew this was so uncharacteristic of these two to go completely radio silent with no reason that the parents just went straight to the police and filed missing person reports. The police would launch an investigation very quickly, but they didn't have much to go on. All they knew was 2 adults were not answering their phone, but that was it. And so they started by trying to locate Kim and Chu's phones, but neither phone was giving off a signal, so they couldn't find them. And so next, the police went to Yelpo Beach and began talking to people who were there on the day that Kim and Chu were to ask them if they had noticed anything funny, if they had seen the couple, did you notice them fighting? Were they talking to anyone unusual? Anything. But nobody remembered anything out of the ordinary, and the few people who had seen Kim and Chu on the day they were at Yelpo Beach, they said they seemed like a very happy, normal couple that were not fighting at all and were just enjoying their time in Yelpo Beach. And so over the course of that weekend, the police tried everything they could to try to locate Kim and Chu and figure out what happened, but they really made no progress whatsoever, and Kim and Chu never checked in by the end of that weekend. But everything would change on that Monday, September 3rd. On that day, a fisherman spotted a body floating in the water near Yelpo Beach, and it was Chu's body. And then 2 days after that, on September 5th, Kim's body washed up at a dock at a nearby fishing village. Both Kim and Chu were totally unrecognizable after being submerged in water for as long as they had been. Autopsies would show that Kim and Chu also had lots of bone fractures, but it wasn't clear if they were beaten by someone or something and that's what caused the fractures, or if they were just a product of being in the water for so long and smashing into rocks and boats and that kind of thing. But the police thought, this looks like there could be foul play involved. Maybe they were murdered. And so the police went back and began scouring all the footage from all the cameras at Yelpo Beach to see if maybe they could find some clip that would show what happened to this couple. And eventually, one of the detectives who was looking through all this footage found something really interesting. He found a very short clip of the couple over at that fishing pier that they had been walking towards. However, they were not up on the fishing pier like you would expect. They were below the fishing pier on the sand, and they were kind of standing next to each other, holding each other close, and there was nobody else around them. It was like this totally weird thing. Now, as weird as this was, because it made no sense for them to be below the fishing pier, there didn't appear to be any hazards or other people or anything near them. It was like they just chose to be under there for some reason. But regardless, the police would actually use this video clip to close the case. The police would say that, based on this clip, it appears that this was the final moment of the couple, underneath this pier, and then something happened. Either an accident, they might have fallen in the water or something and they drowned, or maybe, this couple elected to take their lives together. And while Kim and Chu's families vehemently disagreed with the police assessment, there was nothing they could do. The case was now closed. Nobody was trying to figure out what happened to Kim and Chu. That is, until 4 weeks later, on September 26, 2007, when two more bodies, two young women, washed up on shore right around the same area where Kim and Chu had. The two young women had a lot of similarities to Kim and Chu. They were in their early 20s, they were tourists at Yelpo Beach, and their autopsies discovered that they had several bone fractures. And so this was enough for the police to launch a much bigger investigation into what was going on at Yelpo Beach, which included reopening the Kim and Chu case. And so a detective was assigned to go back through all the evidence in the Kim and Chu case and kind of re-examine it. And so this detective did look through all these pictures, and he would find one picture that broke the case wide open. Back on the night that Kim and Chu were at Yelpo Beach and they began walking towards the fishing pier, Kim had abruptly stopped and raised his finger and pointed at something, and then seconds later, he and Chu were running in that direction. Well, what Kim had spotted was a fisherman who was standing below the fishing pier, and he was very obviously making his way over to his fishing boat to go back out on the water. And Kim just felt like it would be really cool to go ask that fisherman if they could join him and go out on the water with him on his fishing boat to get a view of Yelpo Beach that way. And Chu, when she heard this idea, thought it was a great idea, and the two of them ran to the pier to try to catch this fisherman before he took off. And so that was why there was footage of the couple standing underneath the fishing pier. They were actually talking to this fisherman who could not be seen in frame. The fisherman was a 70-year-old man named Wu Jun Gwen, and he made his living selling octopus. And at first, when Kim and Chu approached Wu and asked to go with him on his boat, he said, "No, I don't want you to come with me." But Kim and Chu seemed really desperate to go out with him. Then finally, he relented and said, "Okay, you can tag along." Wu was very thin and short, but he had been working on fishing boats since he was a child. And so despite his appearance of being this kind of small, frail guy, he was actually really physically strong. And despite Wu's kind of harmless seeming exterior, inside, Wu was a very, very disturbed person. The reason Wu did not want to bring Kim and Chu with him out on this boat is he knew he would have an urge that he would not be able to control. But when they kept begging him over and over again to go with him, he finally just accepted that this was going to happen. He allowed them on his boat, he brought them out onto the water, and sure enough, he would act on those urges. Once Wu's boat was out on the water far away from the beach, he immediately pushed Kim overboard, and so Kim falls into the water, and then Wu grabbed this long metal grappling hook and began beating Kim in the water on his face, his arms, his hands, as Kim desperately tried to climb back in the boat. And eventually, Wu literally beat Kim to death. And at the same time, Chu is on this boat watching this happening. And so after her boyfriend has been beaten to death, Wu turns on Chu and does the same thing to her. He chucks her overboard and beats her until she dies from this grappling hook. And then afterward, Wu just got back behind the wheel, putted back to shore, and sold his octopus like nothing had happened. And Wu very likely would have gotten away with these first two murders, except 4 weeks later, it just so happened that two more tourists, those two young women, just happened to ask Wu the same question. "Can we go out with you on your boat?" And he would kill them the same way he killed Kim and Chu. Except one of those two young women, while they were out on the water in his boat before they were attacked, she sensed something was wrong, and she sent a text message saying she was in trouble on a boat. And when the police found these two women's bodies and found that text message, they immediately searched the registry that listed all the boats that had been out on the water near Yelpo Beach that day. And because it was a holiday, there was nobody out on the water except for one boat. And that boat was Wu's boat. And this is where that photo the detective found on Chu's camera roll, when finally somebody looked through the photos, that's where that photo comes into play. The last picture that Chu took is of Wu. Wu is right in front of her, he's piloting the boat out into the open ocean, and Chu just took a picture of him, not knowing what was actually happening, that this guy was driving her out to her death. Ultimately, Wu would be convicted of the murders, even though he didn't really offer up any clear explanation as to why he killed these people. He just kind of acted on these urges, so to speak, and he would be sentenced to death, and he would become the oldest death row inmate in South Korea. On the morning of June 25th, 2007, a 28-year-old man named Mike Barnett woke up to the sound of pounding rain on the roof of his home, which was located in Hull, which is a city in northern England. Mike groaned as he rolled out of bed. It had been raining like this for the past month, and he and the rest of the people in Hull were just totally over it. But another reason he groaned is he knew that he would have to go to his job at a tropical fish store, even though he was not scheduled to work that day. There was a street right behind the tropical fish store that always completely flooded out from all these debris getting clogged in the drain, and the owner of the tropical fish store, so Mike's boss, who was an elderly guy, he would always go out and try to clear the debris himself, and Mike just knew, he really needed help, and today he knew his boss would be out there, and so he just felt like it was his responsibility to go in and help him clear out the debris. So Mike got dressed, he had some breakfast, and then as quietly as he could, he slipped out the front door. Mike was careful not to make too much noise because he didn't want to wake his dad, who he lived with. Mike and his dad had always been very close, but after the death of Mike's mother, he and his father had become even closer, and so they actually really enjoyed living together. But Mike also knew that his dad was very protective of him and very likely would not like the idea of Mike going out in this horrible storm to go try to clear debris in a flooded out street. It just was too dangerous. And Mike just didn't want to deal with that right now, and so he was able to slip out without waking up his dad. Mike hopped in his car and he drove to the fish store, and as soon as he got there, he hopped out, he went around to the back side of the shop, and sure enough, the entire street out back was totally flooded. Clearly, debris had blocked the drainage system. Now, Mike's boss was not out there yet. Mike could see him inside the shop, kind of going about his morning, and so Mike, without even going inside, just began wading into the water to begin clearing debris. The drain that was clogged by all this debris was located just off to the side of the sidewalk. It was down in a culvert. And so Mike very carefully walked off that sidewalk into this very cold, muddy water, and he began moving in the direction of where he knew the drain was. And so as he's walking, the water is down to his ankles, maybe up to his knees at some point, but he gets closer and closer to where he knows this drainage is down in this culvert. And suddenly Mike begins feeling this unbelievable suction at his feet that began pulling him basically straight down. Mike tried to move, but his feet were anchored to the ground. And then before long, he began getting pulled forward towards this drain, and then down he went. And as he went all the way down to his neck in the water, he felt this unbelievable pain in his thigh. Mike didn't know it, but his leg had been sucked through the drainage gate that was all blocked up. There were still some holes in it, and so his leg had gone through one of those holes, and it had pulled him all the way up to the top of his thigh and brutally snapped his leg in the process. And so Mike is in blinding pain from his leg being shattered and run through this grate. And he's literally up to his neck in this frigid water, and the wind's blowing and it's raining and the water's going in his mouth. And so Mike begins to panic and he's trying to pull himself out. He can't. And then he begins screaming for help. And at that moment, the owner of the fish store, who was still inside the store, looked out the window and he saw Mike flailing around. And instinctively, the owner could tell, just from the panicked look on Mike's face, that whatever was happening to him was an emergency. And so the owner just picked up the phone, called the police, and after telling them what was happening, the owner ran out to Mike. When the first police officers arrived on the scene, Mike was still in the water up to his neck, and the shop owner was right next to him. And the police officers, they assessed the situation in front of them, and they thought, okay, clearly this guy, Mike, is trapped in the water. This is serious, but we can pull him out. That's the obvious solution here. And so the two officers walked up to Mike, they waded through the water and got on either side of him, kind of pushing the shop owner out of the way. And then the two officers grabbed Mike's shoulders. These are strong police officers, and they began pulling on Mike. And as soon as they did, Mike let out this unbelievably loud scream of just pure agony. And in fact, his scream was so guttural that the two officers let go and were kind of startled by it. And very quickly, these officers realized this situation is far worse than it appears. Because not only is this guy totally stuck and he can't be moved, but, they're looking around and the rain is still coming down and it's clear the water is still slowly rising. And because Mike's body was situated over the grate, he himself was causing even more blockage, increasing how much the street was flooding. Meaning the officers knew they had to get Mike out as soon as possible or he would drown. But over the next several hours, more police officers, firefighters, EMTs, Good Samaritans, everybody showed up on the scene, and there were so many attempts to get Mike out of the water, ranging from trying to cut the grate, but the water was too muddy so nobody could see through it, and the water was so strong that nobody could set the bolt cutters on the actual grate. And then at one point they even tied a winch around Mike and tried to pull him out with a Land Rover, but every intervention failed. The rushing water that was pinning Mike to this grate was so strong, and Mike's pain in his leg was so high, it made it nearly impossible to move him. And so finally, at the 4-hour mark that Mike has been trapped in this water, a decision was made amongst all the first responders to amputate. So the police called a doctor who was willing to perform the leg amputation, and then after doing it, Mike could sense something was up. Clearly it's not going well, and he began frantically asking the police and all the first responders, "When are you going to get me out of here? When are you going to get me out of here?" And they just kept telling him, soon, Mike, hold on, it's going to be okay. Meanwhile, the owner of the shop at this point had called Mike's dad to tell him what was going on. And so as all these people are waiting for this doctor to show up to cut Mike's leg off, Mike's father shows up and basically barrels through the crowd and starts screaming, "I'll get my son out of here." But as soon as he saw his son, he was totally taken aback. Mike was up to his chin in water. There was a diver behind him in the water with him, holding him up, barely keeping his head above the water. Mike's face was totally pale, and his eyes were totally unfocused, and he had this weird blank expression like he wasn't even there. And then a second later, a whole wall of police came running up to Mike's dad to stop him from getting any closer, and they told Mike's father they were doing everything they could to try to get his son out, and for now, they told him he just needed to go home. And so even though Mike's dad did not want to abandon his son, he could tell with all these police standing there in front of him, there was no way he was going to be able to go up there with his son. And so he would turn around and head back home without even speaking to his son. And then, when Mike's dad got home, he turned on the news, and the news was showing live coverage of his son trapped in that grate. And just a couple of minutes later, Mike's dad would watch his son die on the news. By the time that doctor arrived with that special saw to cut off Mike's leg, it was already too late. Mike had passed away from hypothermia. On a July day in 1976, a man named Ray suddenly felt this unbelievable pain in his chest. And so Ray, he grabbed his chest and he grimaced, and then the pain subsided. Now, Ray had never experienced any sort of pain like that before, but he knew he was getting older, and so things like heart attacks and heart disease were definitely on his mind. But he told himself that he was okay. A couple of days ago, he had gone to this big military veteran convention, and he had stayed up late and had lots of food and lots of drink, and so he was telling himself that, now he was paying for kind of letting loose. But after Ray lied down for a minute, thinking that might help him, he sat up suddenly because, again, the chest pain was back. And so quickly, Ray was rushed to the hospital, and when he got there, he began coughing up all this pink froth. And the doctors had no idea why. This was not a heart attack, this was not heart disease, this was something else. And not long after Ray was admitted to this hospital, all across the state, more men began being admitted to emergency rooms with the same symptoms as Ray, and nobody knew what it was. And so doctors all across the state began to panic that this was the start of a deadly epidemic. To hear the full story, check out The Philly Killer, which is episode number 15 of the MrBallen's Medical Mysteries podcast. And remember, you can actually binge episodes of MrBallen's Medical Mysteries early on Amazon Music, because we release them in 8-episode batches, and so you get all 8 on Amazon Music. Or if you're listening on any other platform, you'll get all the episodes, but you'll get them in 1-episode increments each week. Again, go check out MrBallen's Medical Mysteries. So that's going to do it. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to check out our podcast called the MrBallen Podcast, where we have literally hundreds of stories, a lot like these, that are available to listen to right now. Again, the podcast is just called the MrBallen Podcast, and it's available on Amazon Music. Wait, don't go anywhere. If you liked today's video about places you can't go, well, you're in luck, because we have a whole series of them. Click here. Late on the afternoon of March 22nd, 2015, 29-year-old Denise Huskins reached for her buzzing cell phone, and when she saw who was texting her, she immediately felt this knot of anxiety in her stomach. It was her on-again, off-again boyfriend, Aaron Quinn, and right now, at least according to Denise, they were off, and likely it was going to stay that way. But now, Aaron was texting Denise, saying he really wanted to talk to her and would she please come over. It was a Sunday, and Denise was home alone in her little apartment in Vallejo, California, which is inside the San Francisco Bay Area, and Denise really just did not have it in her to go talk to her ex-boyfriend. Really, she didn't have plans to go out anywhere. She just wanted to stay in. And so she typed back that she was in for the night and this would have to wait. But as soon as she sent that text, immediately she got another text from Aaron. For a long minute, Denise just sat there on the couch looking at her phone, wondering what she was going to do. Denise and Aaron had met the previous summer after Denise had moved to Vallejo from Boston, Massachusetts to work at a hospital in Vallejo called Kaiser Hospital. Denise had her PhD in physical therapy, and Kaiser Hospital had a great physical therapy program, especially for people with brain and spinal cord injuries. And Kaiser Hospital was also where Aaron worked. She and Aaron had been immediately attracted to each other. Aaron was tall and fit with dark hair and piercing eyes, and he loved to cook. And Denise, she was blonde and blue-eyed and very outdoorsy and driven. And so pretty much right away, Aaron and Denise would get into these intense conversations where they each would kind of dive into the other person's life. I mean, they were really connecting on a deep level. But even though they both clearly got along great and they were really connecting, their relationship got off to kind of a rocky start. Aaron had actually been engaged to be married before he met Denise, but Aaron's fiance had cheated on him, and so he had ended the relationship, and it was during that time, right after this relationship had ended, that he met Denise. And so Denise was kind of like a rebound, and she kind of felt like a rebound, but again, they're getting along great, and so both were optimistic that it was more than that. And so Aaron and Denise had officially begun dating in the fall of 2014, but 7 months later, so in March of 2015, when Denise was getting these text messages from Aaron, at least in Denise's mind, their relationship really was done. Because Denise had caught Aaron texting his ex-fiance, basically begging her to get back together with him. And so Denise felt really hurt. You know, she understood that that was a really intense relationship. And of course, Aaron would still have feelings for his ex to some degree, but she felt really betrayed. And so she told Aaron that that was it. But it was really painful for Denise because she did love Aaron, even though she knew, this relationship likely wasn't going to work. And now here Aaron was blowing up her cell phone with text messages to meet up and talk, and he just wasn't taking no for an answer. And so Denise finally typed out this long message back to Aaron, basically saying, look, I don't feel comfortable coming to your house. It's the house that you shared with your ex. I don't want to go there. We can talk another time. I think for right now, what you need to focus on, Aaron, is kind of like recording me. Take me out on dates and show me that you really want to be with me, because right now there's no trust. And Aaron, to his credit, wrote back to Denise and basically said, yes, I'm definitely willing to do that. I want to put in the work to win you back. I care about you, Denise. But he said, I really have something important to tell you, and I just don't feel comfortable talking about it anywhere else besides at my house. So please, can you just come over tonight? It's really important that I see you. And at first, Denise really did just kind of hold the line, and she told Aaron that, no, I'm not going to come to your house. But again, Aaron, he just would not let it go, and he really seemed actually very eager to see Denise, and it made Denise feel special, and so eventually she kind of gave it up and said, you know what? Okay, I'll come by. And after that, Denise got up off the couch, she got dressed, she called their favorite pizza place and ordered some pizza that she would pick up and bring to his house for them to eat that night, and then she headed out to her car and pulled out of her driveway. At about 5:30 p.m. that night, Denise arrived at Aaron's two-story home on Mare Island, which is actually just a little peninsula in Vallejo, California. And Denise, she grabbed the pizzas off the passenger seat. She grabbed her overnight bag because she was optimistic that, they're about to have a great talk and maybe rekindle and maybe she'll stay the night. And so with her things and her pizza, she walked up to the front door and knocked. The next day was a Monday, and Aaron and Denise were both scheduled to work at the hospital that day. But at around 7 a.m. that morning, Aaron called into the hospital sick and said he couldn't come in, and Denise sent a text message to her boss saying that a family emergency had just come up and she would not be at work all week. When Denise's boss got this text message, immediately he was like, this doesn't make any sense. First of all, Denise never missed work, so this was totally anomalous. And he also knew that Denise was applying for this very prestigious orthopedic fellowship that she needed to submit the paperwork for by Friday. And he knew she had a lot of work to do on this paperwork that basically required her to be at work that week to get it all done. And so if she was missing the week, then it looked like she would not be applying for this fellowship. And that just seemed totally unusual because Denise was really serious about this fellowship. And so Denise's boss wrote back to her and just said, I understand you have an emergency, we're here if you need us, take whatever time you need. And then a few hours later, her boss checked his phone again and he saw that she had not written him back. And so Denise's boss was like, wow, I guess, she really must be dealing with some serious family emergency that's keeping her from using her phone. About 7 hours later, at around 2 p.m. on this Monday, where Aaron and Denise had not shown up for work, there was a 911 call that came into the Vallejo Police Department. And the person making the 911 call was Aaron. And Aaron's voice was totally slurred, and then he told this very confusing story about some sort of kidnapping, and then he begged police for help. 2 police officers happened to be near Mare Island, where Aaron lived, and so within 2 minutes of this 911 call coming in, those 2 officers were knocking on Aaron's front door. And when Aaron let them inside, these officers noticed 3 things in quick succession. The first was Aaron was obviously drunk or high. He was under the influence of some substance. He just did not seem right. 2, there were at least a dozen empty beer bottles lining a back wall in the kitchen. And 3, the entire house reeked of cleaning chemicals. One of the officers immediately turned to Aaron and said, "Are you on drugs?" And Aaron would say, "Yes, I am on drugs, but these drugs were given to me by the kidnappers." The officers immediately exchanged confused glances, looked back at Aaron, and then just said, okay, well, we're going to take a look around. And so the officers wound up going upstairs, and as they went upstairs, that cleaning chemical smell got stronger and stronger, and they made their way into the master bedroom, and they saw the ground had obviously been recently vacuumed, and that cleaning smell was really strong in here. The sheets on the bed were all gone, except for the fitted sheet that sat over the mattress. And so the officers were about to leave the master bedroom and keep looking when one of the officers stopped and he noticed something on the bed, and he called the other officer over, and they walked over and they looked down, and sure enough, on the bed was about a quarter-sized drop of blood. The police officers left the master bedroom and they went back downstairs where Aaron was, and they walked up to him and said, okay, tell us again what happened with these kidnappers and what's going on here. And Aaron would launch into a totally bizarre story. Through slurred speech, Aaron would say 12 hours earlier, so around 3 in the morning that morning, so early Monday morning, Aaron said he was in his house with his girlfriend, Denise, when suddenly these men wearing wetsuits broke into the house, and they immediately tied up Aaron and Denise and then made them wear these goggles that had been all taped up, so once they were on your face, you couldn't see anything. Aaron would tell the police that the intruders, in addition to wearing wetsuits, they also were carrying guns, tasers, also laser pointers, and also very high-powered flashlights. And so when they came in, there were all these lights and beams everywhere. I mean, it was totally chaotic. Aaron then explained to police that after he and Denise had been tied up and had these goggles on, the men in wetsuits came over to them and put headphones on each of them, and then they played this recording, which had this weird, soothing music, and then somebody narrating, telling Aaron and Denise that they were not in any danger, that this was just a robbery, and to stay calm and nothing would happen to them. And so Aaron and Denise had done just that. They tried to follow orders. And then at some point, the headphones came off, and both Aaron and Denise were told to go to separate rooms, and they kind of fumbled their way into the separate rooms, at which point the men demanded they give up their banking information and passwords, and Aaron and Denise did that. They gave up all their banking info, and then Aaron and Denise were brought back into the living room. They were tied back up again, and then even though Aaron and Denise couldn't actually see this, they heard the sound of somebody apparently coming in that sounded like a doctor, who then took Aaron and Denise's blood pressure before administering this drug to them that made them both very sleepy. And then before Aaron and Denise passed out from this drug, Denise was taken by the intruders, and the intruders told Aaron that they had rigged a camera system inside of his house to watch him so he couldn't leave to go save Denise. And so Aaron basically just stayed in the house until he fell asleep from this drug. And then when he woke up again and managed to get his restraints off, he saw that Denise really was gone. And so Denise had to be with the kidnappers. After Aaron was done telling this totally weird story, which again, you gotta remember, as he's talking, he sounds totally drunk. And so they kept having to ask him to say again what he was saying, and, Aaron's just kind of loopy, and so the whole thing is just so weird. And so when Aaron was finally done telling the story, the two officers just stared at him in silence, and then the officers looked at each other, and without even saying anything, they both were thinking the same thing. Probably this guy has killed his girlfriend, Denise, and after he killed her, he must have spent time cleaning the house, which is why they smelled all the cleaning chemicals, and then maybe when he was done, he felt bad about what he had done, and so he began drinking beers to kind of cope with what he had done, and that's why all those empty bottles were there, and that's why he was acting so drunk right now. And then at some point he had worked up the courage to call 911 and pretend that he didn't know where his girlfriend was and make up this whole alibi about these weird kidnappers that came in and did this stuff. But obviously it was just a ruse. This guy killed his girlfriend. That's what happened. And so finally, one of these officers spoke to Aaron and they said, "You're going to need to come to the station with us and explain yourself." As much as I love whipping up old Sing-a-long's favorite meal, a nice hot frappy mug of muskox and blobfish stew, sometimes I just don't have enough time. And when that happens, my quick option is a couple of mystery bird nuggets. However, as we learned last night, old Sing-a-long is allergic to emu. Emu was the mystery bird we sucked down last night. So unfortunately, mystery bird nuggets are out. However, I found an even better quick option, Factor. With Factor, you can skip all those grocery store trips and all the prepping and chopping and cleaning up that comes with preparing a full meal, but you still get the top-notch flavor and nutritional quality that you need. Factor's fresh, never frozen meals are ready in just 2 minutes, so all you gotta do is heat and enjoy. And Factor is flexible. I can adjust my order size to make sure I have enough to share with my family, and it's easy to skip a week or two anytime you know you're not gonna be around. For those of you who are confused, because I've previously stated my favorite meal kit is HelloFresh, well, don't worry, HelloFresh owns Factor, because HelloFresh wants to offer a wider array of meal options to satisfy all of their customers. So if you're in need of a quick meal option to replace your mystery bird nuggets, then look no further than Factor. My favorite Factor meal is the grilled chicken with browned butter Yukon mash. It's pretty good. Head to factor75.com or click the link down below and use code MrBallen50 for 50% off your first Factor box. It didn't take long for the police in Vallejo to launch this massive search all over Mare Island to look for Denise. And at this point, they were kind of looking for a body because based on what was going on in Aaron's house and the story he told, it did seem like very likely she had been murdered and disposed of somewhere. And so they had dogs out and dive teams out in the water. They had hundreds of volunteers looking everywhere. And at the same time, Aaron was brought to the police station and they began going over every single detail of his story, trying to get more information about these kidnappers, because as much as they didn't believe him, they did need to officially rule out that there was no kidnapping. And so they needed all the information about these kidnappers, who they were, what they looked like, what they sounded like, everything. And at the same time, police were talking to Aaron. Police also brought in Denise's roommate, and they asked the roommate, "Do you know anything about Denise's relationship with Aaron?" And the roommate would say, those two have had a very troubled relationship. And the roommate would say that, as far as they understood, Aaron and Denise were not a couple anymore. And so police would actually go over to Aaron in the police station and they would say, "Hey, we have people saying that you and Denise, who you called your girlfriend, you guys were not dating. You had broken up. Explain yourself." And Aaron would say, "Well, actually, that's why Denise was coming over. Before all this kidnapping happened, she was coming over so we could reconcile." And we did. We had reconciled. We were back together when the kidnappers in wetsuits came inside the house. But the more police looked into Aaron's kidnapping story, the less it made sense. And it really didn't make sense to begin with. And so really, it just got weirder and weirder and weirder. Like, for one, Aaron said that he and Denise had been kind of forced to give up their banking information and their passwords, and they did that. They gave that up to the kidnappers. But when police looked into Aaron and Denise's banking records, there was no money withdrawn. The only activity on either of those accounts was on Aaron's account. 2 hours before Aaron called 911, he called his credit card holder and attempted to get them to give him a large cash advance so he could buy a boat. When police asked Aaron about the strong cleaning chemicals smell in his house, Aaron absolutely denied doing anything to clean his house. He didn't know how that happened. Also, Aaron would tell police that these kidnappers had actually wanted a ransom to be paid to them, but he said it was only for $8,500. And so police are like, why would these kidnappers take Denise and run away with her and risk very serious jail time for $8,500? It just seemed way too low for what they were doing. And then there was another weird detail that came out of interviewing Aaron at the police station. One of the police officers had noticed that Aaron's eyes were totally dilated, his pupils were huge, and for a little while, police had thought maybe that was because he was on some drug or something which can cause your pupils to dilate. But based on the weirdness of the story that Aaron was relaying to them, they actually began to suspect that Aaron was having a schizophrenic break. That is a symptom of a schizophrenic break. Schizophrenia is a very serious mental illness that often begins to appear in young adults, and Aaron was only 30 years old, so he's at the right age for this to happen. And while schizophrenia does not make people violent, it does make people very paranoid, and it also can cause hallucinations and mental disturbances. And so when police were looking at the details of Aaron's story about men in wetsuits breaking into his house and taking his blood pressure before stealing his girlfriend, but also cleaning his house at some point, that just seemed so weird and kind of crazy that it did seem to kind of line up with schizophrenia. By 9 p.m. on March 23rd, so 7 hours after Aaron had called 911 to report Denise missing, the Vallejo police decided they needed to call in the FBI because this was just so weird, and we have this missing person who could have been kidnapped, or maybe they're dead or hurt or something. I mean, there was just so much going on with this case, they needed backup. And when the FBI arrived in Vallejo, the first thing they did is they took Aaron and they gave him a lie detector test, and he failed it completely. And after finding out he had failed it completely, he immediately lawyered up. By the next day, March 24th, there were over 100 different search teams all across Mare Island and around Vallejo, California, looking for Denise. Police sonar had also picked up a body-sized mass out in the bay, but so far the divers had not been able to find it. Aaron, by this point, had gotten his lawyer and left the police station, and by now, Denise's picture was all over the news and newspapers. It was up on posters, on telephone poles all over town, and TV news channels were parked outside of Aaron's house, just waiting for him to come out or waiting for any activity. But despite all this activity, the detectives and the FBI agents that were working this case had really not made any significant progress. All they thought was, Aaron's definitely hiding something. But then something changed. A little bit after noon on March 24th, a reporter for the San Francisco Chronicle, who was camped outside of Aaron's home, got a very weird email. The email was from the kidnappers, the wetsuit-wearing, blood pressure-taking kidnappers who broke into Aaron's home and took Denise. And in this email to the reporter, it said that Denise was fine, and there actually was a recording of Denise's voice reading that day's news, which confirmed that she was alive at least as recently as that morning. But there were two very suspicious things about this email. The first one was the recording of Denise's voice, the proof of life recording. Well, she did not sound in any way stressed. She sounded utterly calm, like she was reading the news, like it was completely no big deal.
Earlier today, there was a plane crash in the house.
And the second thing that was very suspicious was the email address the kidnappers had used to message this reporter was an email address that belonged to Aaron. When this reporter told police about this, investigators were like, you know what, this actually doesn't make this any more clear. This makes things exponentially more confusing. Denise did appear to be alive, which was a good thing, but it now really appeared that Aaron was involved in whatever was going on here, and based on how calm Denise sounded on this recording, she could be involved in it too. And investigators' suspicions only grew when they went to Aaron and they asked him, have the kidnappers tried calling you at any point? And Aaron would say, yes, they have, and he showed them his phone. Well, the police would trace the phone calls that Aaron claimed had come into his cell phone from the kidnappers, and when they traced the kidnapper's number, they found it was connected to a burner phone. A burner phone is something that drug dealers will use because it's totally anonymous. It's like a one-time use cell phone that you use temporarily, you have this number temporarily, and then when you're done with the phone, there's no history that you personally had that cell phone. But police were clever, and they figured out where this burner phone was actually purchased from, and it was purchased from a nearby Target, and they looked at the security footage of around the time when this burner phone, was purchased from this Target, and they saw the person who had bought it walk out of the store. And the person who had bought this burner phone was this white man who was tall and fit with dark hair, and it basically looked exactly like Aaron. And then, 2 days later, on March 25th, Denise herself walked up to her mother's home in Huntington Beach, California, which is roughly 400 miles south of Vallejo, California, where she went missing. And so Denise's mother was not home when Denise showed up on her doorstep, and so Denise wound up going to the next door neighbor and using their phone to call her father. And Denise's story that she would tell her dad was even more bizarre than Aaron's story. She said she had been held captive by 4 men in this small room, and these men would tell her that they were simply doing a task for a client, and what they were doing now with her was just following their protocol. Denise would tell police that she was well taken care of while she was in captivity. They let her eat food, they gave her water, they even let her shower and brush her teeth. Denise initially was very open to speaking to Vallejo police detectives about what happened to her, but when they said the FBI really wanted to talk to her and they would literally send a jet to her in Huntington Beach and fly her back to Vallejo, she refused. And then, like Aaron, she immediately lawyered up and stopped talking. And so by this point, all the investigators are like, there's no way these two actually got kidnapped. This whole thing is some weird, elaborate hoax, and now they know they've been caught, and so they're going quiet. And so that night that Denise was found on March 25th, the Vallejo police held a press conference and told the public that they do not believe these two were ever kidnapped. They don't really know what happened, but at this point they are not pursuing kidnappers, and the public should not be worried about rogue kidnappers in the area. But after this press conference, the police couldn't help but think to themselves, why would these two people who are successful, they come from good families, they have loads of future prospects, their lives were good. Why would they stage this hoax? What do they stand to gain? It really just didn't make any sense. For weeks, the investigation into whatever happened to Aaron and Denise continued, but there was virtually no progress. The media was still very interested in this case. It was totally salacious, and they had dubbed this case the Gone Girl case in reference to a movie about a woman who fakes her own kidnapping. As for Denise and Aaron, they stayed lawyered up, and the only message they put out to the public was that they were telling the truth. And so really, this case just didn't make sense to anybody until about 2.5 months later, on June 5th, 2015. Early that morning, a police officer in a town called Dublin, which is just south of Vallejo, California, found a piece of evidence that basically broke the Gone Girl case wide open. The evidence this police officer found was a cell phone. Not a burner phone that's totally anonymous, but a real cell phone that is registered with a phone company and therefore is registered with an individual person. And police were able to trace this cell phone back to its owner. And this discovery would lead investigators 200 miles to the northeast of Vallejo to the small remote cabin in South Lake Tahoe, California. And at this cabin, police would find a stolen car, a white Mustang. And the white Mustang actually belonged to someone who lived in Vallejo. And so, with their guns drawn and their dogs at the ready to be released, the police and the FBI, they opened up the door to this cabin, and inside was a tall, fit, and slender white man with dark hair. The cabin was a total mess, with discarded food and trash and piles of clothes everywhere, but none of that really stood out to the police. Instead, what stood out to them as they're yelling at this guy to stay where he is all around the cabin, all over the ground, kind of on top of all the trash and mess, were things like laser pointers and high-powered flashlights and zip ties and goggles, like swim goggles with tape all across the front of them blocking out your view. The police had finally found one of the kidnappers. And while this kidnapper looked exactly like Aaron, he was a tall, fit, slender white man with dark hair, it wasn't Aaron. In fact, neither Aaron nor Denise had ever met this person, and this person, this kidnapper, had never met Denise or Aaron. There was absolutely no connection between them. This kidnapper's name was Matthew Muller, and he was a 38-year-old Harvard-trained lawyer and former Marine who had totally just crashed and burned out of his law practice and then took up this life of committing all these totally bizarre crimes. It would turn out the totally weird stories that Aaron and Denise had told police about what had happened to them was all true. The only thing they got wrong was there wasn't multiple people breaking into the house in wetsuits. It was only ever one person. It was Matthew Muller, the guy behind all this. And maybe just kind of in their panic and not knowing what's going on, Aaron and Denise had kind of thought, oh, there's multiple people here. But there wasn't. It was just Matthew. Also, it would turn out Aaron and Denise were not the first people that Matthew had done this to. The reason that police officer in Dublin, California had found that cell phone, which broke the case wide open and led police to this cabin in South Lake Tahoe, was because on the night that officer found the cell phone, so June 5th, Matthew Muller had attacked another couple in the middle of the night in their home. But that couple had been able to fight Matthew Muller off, and Matthew had dropped his cell phone in their home before he fled. And so when this couple had reported this to police, that was how they got that cell phone. In terms of Muller's motivation for doing what he was doing, well, Muller was absolutely brilliant, like borderline genius, super smart guy, but he was extremely mentally unwell. He had severe psychosis, and he was also bipolar. And so basically he wasn't seeing reality for what it was. And at some point in one of his kind of psychotic fits, he had somehow came across Aaron and Denise and become absolutely obsessed with them. He began surveilling them nonstop with a drone for 3 weeks before he attacked them, learning their patterns and who they talked to and what they did. And in fact, Aaron, when he found out that was what Matthew was doing, watching him and Denise with a drone, Aaron would tell police, oh my goodness, I actually remember one night before the kidnapping looking up and seeing this glinting light in the sky, and he thought, that looks like a drone, why is it out here? But Aaron was a normal person and didn't suspect that somebody who was totally unhinged was spying on him with a drone, and so he had forgotten about it. And so after Muller had surveilled Aaron and Denise for 3 weeks using his drone, he was ready. And so in the middle of the night, he broke into Aaron's house, wearing a wetsuit. He tied up Aaron and Denise, and he put those goggles on both of them so they couldn't see anything. And then he put on those headphones on both of them that played the soothing music and also had that narration where it was telling them, hey, you're going to be fine. This is a robbery. Just stay calm and do what you're told. But after these headphones went on both of them, Matthew would sexually assault Denise. And in fact, at least one other victim of Matthew Muller has come forward since his arrest to say that she too was sexually assaulted by Matt. And so after Matt had taken Denise and left Aaron's house with her, Aaron, he did fall asleep from the drug he was given from Matthew. And then when he woke up the next morning, he managed to get out of his restraints. And, he's still affected by the drug that was in his system. And he sees that Denise is gone. And so the first thing he does is, oh my God, I need to find a way to pay the ransom to this kidnapper. Because again, the kidnapper, Matthew, had said around Aaron that he wanted $8,500. And so Aaron thought he could get that money. And so he called his credit card company and asked for that cash advance for $8,500 to pay this ransom. But when they asked Aaron why he needed this money, he didn't want to give up that it was for a ransom because he didn't want the kidnapper to know that he had talked to authorities. He was worried about Denise. And so kind of in a panic, Aaron just told the credit card company that he was buying a boat, but really it was for the ransom. Also, Aaron was the one who called in to Kaiser Hospital for both him and Denise, saying they were missing work. He did this because Matthew at some point had instructed Aaron that he would have to do that or something would happen to Denise. And so again, he's just kind of following the instructions, hoping that he can get Denise back. As for the email that the San Francisco Chronicle reporter got that apparently was from the kidnappers, but was sent from Aaron's email account, well, that really was the kidnapper, Matthew Muller, sending this email to the reporter. He just used a special program to basically hijack Aaron's email address. And as for Denise sounding very calm in her proof of life recording that was attached to that email, well, the thought is Denise was very likely in shock at the time she was asked to record this, and so it sounded like she was relaxed, but really she wasn't. Also, just a random side note that I'm sure some of you will have questions about. We don't know why Aaron's house smelled like chemicals. It's assumed that, maybe when Aaron and Denise were all tied up and couldn't see anything because of their goggles, that Matthew Muller, I guess, walked around their house and cleaned it, but we don't know for sure. Matthew Muller is currently serving a 40-year sentence in prison for federal crimes, and just recently he was sentenced to an additional 31 years in prison for state crimes that were in connection to the kidnappings of Aaron and Denise. Aaron and Denise would go on to sue the city of Vallejo, California for basically mistreating them. They had been telling the truth the whole time, but nobody took them seriously, and they would win $2.5 million. Aaron and Denise would go on to get married, they would have a baby, and they would write a book together about their experience, which is called Victim F, From Crime Victims to Suspects to Survivors. Just after 1:30 in the morning on May 12, 1994, a young girl ran out the front door of her home in rural Maine out into the rainy night. Barefoot and terrified, the girl went door to door screaming for help, but no one heard her. Finally, after running nearly 2 miles in the dead of night, she arrived in her little downtown and managed to flag down a restaurant owner. The owner would help the girl call 911, and within minutes, the police would arrive at that young girl's home. And what they would discover there was one of the most horrific crimes ever committed in that small town. Not only because of its sheer brutality, but also because of who committed it and why. We tried to make this story make sense, but sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction. So that's going to do it. If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to check out our podcast called the MrBallen's Podcast, where we have literally hundreds more stories just like this one, many of which are only available on the podcast. Again, it's called the MrBallen's Podcast, and it's available on Amazon Music.